Welcome back to Drunk on Writing and another exciting episode of the Stephen King Dissections, brought to you in part through the patronage of Ariya, Norinth, and Folksy Girl. Today, we are diving into the November 1983 novel Pet Sematary, a sort of retelling of the W. Jacobs short story The Monkey's Paw, and written as King has started to inform us within the novel itself. And I love this little bit about his novels. Every time I read them, it makes me feel a little bit more part of the process. It's a little bit intimate piece of knowledge, you know? It's not something that always needs to be included. Between February 1979 and December 1982, slightly longer than King's other fare at the time. And that's because in 1979, when he finished the first draft, he went and put it on a shelf, as noted as early as this 1983 Washington Post review by Douglas E. Winter. After King completed the first draft, the book he had come to call Pet Sematary using a child's spelling was put away. He did not wish to work on it further. The novel was ringed with King's anxieties about his youngest child, who, it had been feared, fortunately incorrectly, was hydrocephalic. We'll get to that word because that's hard for me to say. Whether the book would have been published entirely of King's volition is now a moot question. Fate intervened in the form of a contractual dispute with his former hardcover publisher, Doubleday. Rewritten in 1982, Pet Sematary appears now only as ransom for substantial money earned by King's early novels that had been withheld from him. King gave a bit more detail on this in an interview he did with Entertainment Weekly in 2019 that I've sort of paraphrased a little bit. We had signed this bullshit thing with Doubleday called the Author Investment Plan, and the idea was, we'll pay you out $50,000 a year and you won't have to pay taxes on anything but that. And to a couple of kids who never had money, $50,000 is like the world, a lot of money. It was the mid-70s after Carrie and Salem's Lot, and basically, Doubleday just wanted to hold on to that money. I even asked the question at one point, well, who gets the interest on this money? There's a long pause, and then my editor, Bill Thompson, said, well, Doubleday does, because they do all the accounting. But the money piled up. Long story short, I had gone over to Viking, and lawyer and agent Arthur B. Green came to me and he said, you know, you have this Doubleday agreement. If you die, the IRS will beggar your family because they'll claim all that money in the Doubleday investment fund is your money. And they'll have to pay taxes on money that you haven't gotten. So I said, well, what do I do about this? And he said, you'll have to give them another book and make it part of the agreement that they can publish the book under their bullshit terms, but they have to break the investment fund. This is why they say to always read the terms of service, I suppose. But no matter how it went down, I'm kind of fairly glad that it did, because if not for that contractual BS, we may have never gotten Pet Sematary at all. King is on record as noting, I just had the greatest time writing the book until I was done with it, and I read it over and I said to myself, this is awful. This is really terrible. I mean, he's even gone on record as saying that he would not have published this book if not for the Doubleday mess. So, I mean, the consensus is, and I happen to agree with it, that he's wrong in this assessment, that it should have been released. And I'm so happy that it was, because 37 years after its initial publication, Pet Sematary has now become my favorite Stephen King novel. Yeah, it made me feel like a Stephen King virgin. It was pure classic King. It was outstanding. And especially if you remember from the last video when we were talking about Christine, it's like a breath of fresh air. And it might be because possibly somehow after 37 years, I went into Pet Sematary completely unspoiled. Aside from what I'd glimpsed in trailers and gleaned from conversation here and there, I knew basically nothing about this story. And I highly suggest that if you have not read Pet Sematary yet, and you're watching this, that you do the same and you turn this off. Please come back though. Or head on over to drunkonwriting.com and sign up for more episodes more often. But please come back, because I want to talk about Pet Sematary because it's so good, but I don't want to spoil it for you. It is that amazing, and you really owe it to yourself to experience this in its purest form. Now, I didn't even see the adaptations. I knew zero, plum diddly squat. And, you know, the book is frightening. It's tense. It's relatable. That's kind of nuts considering, well, all there is to consider about this book. This book goes places. Now, I gotta say, it took me a bit longer than usual to read Pet Sematary. I usually go through these books fairly quickly. I make a lot of notes. Sometimes I reread whole sections. This one took me a while, and not because it was long in any way, shape, or form. It was only, my version was 374 pages, which, when you compare it to Christine, and is rambling, repetitious 471 pages, which often had more lines to the page, no less, this novel seems relatively short, and it was never because I felt bored. On the contrary, I was pretty excited. I was pretty tense. Like I said, I was always sort of on the edge of my seat. However, much like King was after having written the novel, while reading it, I had difficulty even facing it. Even knowing nothing about the storyline, it's very clear from the get-go where this book is going to go. By design, the signs are all there. The foreshadowing all inserted in the right places at the exact right time. Like I said, this is classic King. But I think it's that I was afraid to keep going. Twice, I put this book down. I put it over there on the table and I looked at it and I watched it, and I knew I would get to it eventually. I knew that I wanted to get to it eventually. But I simply couldn't do it. I just left it there. The longest stretch, I think, was 10 days. Why did I do that? Well, because less than 10 pages into the book, I could feel Church's death looming. Winston Churchill's, of course. A card-carrying tomcat and lady killer, now infamous thanks to the book's first 1989 adaptation, and I hate that cat. I didn't know when he would die, but I knew he would. I knew how he would, right from the start, right from this seemingly prophetic line from father figure and oh so incredibly complex Jud. When a good animal gets run down in the road, a kid never forgets. Plus, slightly later, we get an entire chapter devoted to Lewis, our lead, telling his daughter Ellie all about death. A chapter that includes this magnificent line. He's not God's cat. Let God have his own cat. Let God have all the damn old cats he wants and kill them all. Church is mine. I mean, even without my little bit of dramatic emphasis, that surely seems to be building to something, right? I mean, what could that possibly be? And I also knew that Gage, poor, sweet, innocent, cherubic Gage, whose first word home, he says when he pulls into the driveway of the new house, I knew he would die. I knew he would die. Long before it's confirmed through one of Stephen King's throwaway quote-unquote foreshadowing lines, you know, that little bit of premonition that he likes to toss into certain chapters to get you really excited about later on in the book. But yeah, unlike the kid in Cujo, what was his name? Tad, who completely threw me for a loop. Here, I knew it. I expected it. I felt like for the pacing of the book, it just had to happen. At some point, I knew that it would happen. It's telegraphed right in those first few pages as well. Right when, again, Jud says this nice, ominous line, "You just want to watch him around the road, Mrs. Creed. Lots of big trucks on that road." Plus, he keeps getting sick. First that bronchial cold, then all the repeated whoopses with the high fever. Then I think he swallows a marble at some point, and then, of course, the whole hydrocephalic scare. And hydrocephalus, if you aren't aware, is when an accumulation of spinal fluid occurs in the brain. Trust me, it is not something that you want. And once I realized Gage would die, I knew what was going to happen next. I mean, it was inevitable. The power of the Pet Sematary, not the kitschy one out front, the one that is in and of itself rather creepy. I mean, the fact that the kids mow the path over to the cemetery, there's something not right there. Kids never want to mow anything, let alone willingly up to this death hole. I don't think so. And why would you ever want that on your property? Not that one, not that one, but the one that doomed Victor Pascal, who we will talk about in just a moment. The one that he calls the real cemetery. The one beyond the too convenient blowdown. Its very randomness seemingly too artful, too perfect for a work of nature. The Micmac burying ground. Its power was too alluring, too corrupting to not entice our protagonist, who, I've got to say, like the tiger tanks, like the chips and bottles that he talks about crafting throughout the novel, King crafts in such an utterly human fashion, even if his thoughts are sometimes really rather out there. Like when they first pull up to the house and he's not sure it's the right one, he thinks to himself, all the landmarks are right, like the astrological signs the night before Caesar was assassinated. Why are you thinking that, Lewis? That's not a normal thought. Are you okay? I mean, clearly not, given just a little bit later, and this line always rather makes me crack up when I read it or write it, and I've written it a few times now in the course of writing this up. I'm going crazy, Lewis thought wonderingly. Whee! 6 E's on that one, in case you're wondering. But even with those, I was right there the whole time. I was right there in his shoes, making the exact same decision, the exact same wrong decisions, inevitably. But to be fair, I think King expected this. At one point, even toward the end, where it seems that the flow of events are not going to be as I presumed they would be, this thought suddenly pops into Lewis's head. When are you going to do it? That was my exact thought. It was like Stephen King was making fun of me. But maybe I felt this way about the book while reading the book because so much of the story is based on reality. Not just that touch with hydrocephalus that I mentioned earlier, but, well, it's easy to find this information pretty much anywhere at this point, given the age of the book and of the adaptations. But I'll let this excerpt from StephenKing.com explain. In early 1979, Stephen was serving as a writer-in-residence at the University of Maine at Orono, and living in a rented house in nearby Orrington that bordered a major truck route which frequently claimed the lives of dogs and cats. In the woods behind his house, local children had created an informal pet cemetery. One day, his daughter's cat was killed by a passing truck. Stephen was faced with the task of burying the cat in the pet cemetery and then explaining to his daughter what had happened. It was on the third day after the burial that the idea for a novel came to him. He wondered what would happen if a young family were to lose their daughter's cat to a passing truck, and the father, rather than tell his daughter, were to bury the cat in a pet cemetery. And what would happen if the cat were to return the next day, alive, but fundamentally different? I can remember crossing the road, the site quotes King, and thinking that the cat had been killed in the road. And I thought, what if a kid died in that road? And we had had this experience with my son Owen running toward the road where I had just grabbed him and pulled him back. And the two things just came together. On one side of this 2-lane highway was the idea of what if the cat came back? And on the other side of the highway was what if the kid came back? So that when I reached the other side, I had been galvanized by the idea, but not in any melodramatic way. I knew immediately that it was a novel. Stephen King has some rather weird trains of thought, let me tell you, but I mean, what he just described, that's pretty much the beginning of the novel, right? Well, that and Victor Pascal, which I really hope was not based on true events, but, I keep wondering, I'm still wondering as I'm recording this, if Victor Pascal's, who's commonly referred to as just Pascal throughout the book, if his appearance there, his death, was the beginning of the manipulation that we're not really clued into until later on in the book, but is there, I think, right from the very start, because we're certainly told that this is the start. Looking back on it, says the novel, Lewis would think, when he could bear to think about it at all, that the nightmare really began when they brought the dying boy, Victor Pascal, into the infirmary around 10 that morning. And the fact that the ambulance, which Pascal would have been loaded into any other time, suddenly had its radiator blow that very morning, and the fact that Pascal's advice, his warning, is heard solely by Lewis, like a play stage only for his benefit, really only strengthens that theory. But I think that the manipulation, I started to really kind of get into this. I think it's right there from the start. I think it might even occur prior to the events of the novel when Lewis is getting the job, when they're trying to find this house. And I think it might be responsible for even seemingly benign things like Lewis and Rachel's rejuvenated love life. As Jud says at one point in the book, heroin makes dope addicts feel good when they're putting it in their arms, but all the time it's poisoning them, poisoning their bodies and poisoning their way of thinking. This place can be like that, Lewis, and don't you ever forget it. And I think Lewis's subconscious mind, or even perhaps a greater power, a greater manipulator, and the movie, the first film adaptation at least, really kind of runs with this idea. Something recognized that a manipulation was occurring and tried to counteract it, try to fight against it, even giving Lewis such wild yet not unattractive ideas as leaving Maine behind and trying to get a job at Disney, possibly saving him and his family in one strict go, even though he, for some reason, thought of just doing it by himself. I don't know what that was all about, but think about it. On just page 17, Jud suggests that Church be neutered or fixed, as he puts it, because, as he says, a fixed cat don't tend to wander as much. But if it's all the time crossing back and forth, its luck will run out. Lewis wavers on this, considers it, but inevitably goes through with it. I mean, he agrees that, yeah, Church has to be fixed. Which, when thinking back on it, when planning this dissection, really kind of putting all the pieces together, I couldn't quite get to fit in my mind. Surely, having Church fixed would go against the desires of, well, let's just call it like it is, the Wendigo, the one that soured the ground and gave the Micmacs a so-called taste for their own kind. How could neutering Church possibly help its agenda? I couldn't figure out. Doesn't it want Church to try crossing the road and to die and to be buried? Sure, right? But I figured it out. Because all of this tracks, because as a result of Church being neutered, being fixed, he's changed. There was no sign of Church's former feistiness, we're told. No more did he walk like a gunslinger. Now his walk was the slow, careful walk of the convalescent. He allowed Ellie to hand feed him. He showed no sign of wanting to go outside, not even to the garage. He had changed. Perhaps it was ultimately for the better that he had changed. Neither Rachel nor Ellie seemed to notice. And that's the key. They didn't notice. Only Lewis did. And so when Church is inevitably run down, and Jud, as a way of repaying Lewis for saving his wife Norma's life after her heart attack, which what caused that? And is that truly why Jud suggested this heinous thing that he was about to suggest? When he suggests burying Church in the Micmac burial grounds, and Lewis follows him and inevitably agrees, even if Church is going to come back a little stupider, a little slower, a little dead, then he might not even really be Church any longer. Well, he wasn't really Church any longer already, right? So what's a little more change? Heck, I could even picture that scrawled note that Lewis left behind when he brought Church to the vet. I could even picture him hanging that up on the doorknob as he went off to go bury him. I will be back tomorrow, love, Church. Though, of course, Church comes back a little more than a bit different, doesn't he? But not enough to keep Lewis from wondering and testing that wonder of what, if anything, would happen if someone buried a body up on those grounds. And finding out firsthand after a truck driver just felt like putting the pedal to the metal, just like Victor Pascal, I'll have you know. Finding out firsthand what happens when you do. The soil of a man's heart is stonier, we're repeatedly told. A man grows what he can and tends it. There's a lot in that line. So much, really, that it can be tied to, which is probably why it became a mantra for the book. I mean, we heard it several times, but it also got me thinking. Because I chalked up a lot of that feeling on possibly just King's style, on it being based on real life events, the story being based on real life events. But I started to notice something the more and more I got into the book. It was something I sort of picked up subconsciously at first, but after a while I just couldn't keep from acknowledging it, that Pet Sematary is, in many respects, a redressed take on The Shining. No, obviously this doesn't take place in a hotel, and there's really no alcoholism to lay the blame on. But if you compare the two books' story arcs, if you take a look at the characters, their responses, their regrets, their relationships, the way they're manipulated by some outside force, the two books are shockingly similar. In fact, I continuously waited someone to tell Ellie, who keeps having these horrible dreams, these premonitions, or Rachel, who at one point has such a strong feeling that she has to get back to her husband that she does everything in her power to do so, and is helped along the way, even though she is kept from getting there just soon enough. She gets there just at the right time to meet her unfortunate demise. We'll touch on that in a couple minutes, but I kept waiting for one or both of them to be told that they had some sort of version of The Shine. I mean, The Shine has appeared now in several of Stephen King's books. Why should this be any different? And we do get rather obvious nods to Salem's Lot, to The Dead Zone, Cujo, even different seasons, and The Stand, I think, is in there as well. But The Shining, it almost seems purposely left out of the book, almost for comparison's sake. Except for, of course, the fun inclusion of the all work and no play make Jack a dull boy. A likely nod to Stanley Kubrick's adaptation, though the proverb predates the film considerably. A man grows what he can and tends it. I wish I could see that original draft, the one that King shelved back in 79, and compare it to the version I just read 40 years after it was originally written, just to see how much of this nuance, this partial retread was purposeful, possibly a way of sticking it to the publisher. But in the end, I don't think it's a bad thing that there are such similarities between Pet Sematary and The Shining. I don't think it's a bad thing that it follows a similar narrative arc about being manipulated and forced to do things or coerced into doing things that maybe aren't for your benefit. I mean, and plus, it's plenty different after all, and I think, and maybe I'll be lambasted for thinking this, I think this novel actually handles that whole manipulation factor a whole lot better. I mean, the nuance on display here, it's a completely different level of subtle. I didn't really even notice it until it was just kind of just right out there in front of that, and it just made me think back on everything so much differently. It was almost imperceptible until it was pointed out, though there is a lot of telling rather than showing within this book, which might turn some readers off, especially when it comes to Jud. The way he will just go on and on with his wife Norma about the history of the area, the history of the Pet Cemetery. He goes on for ages with some sort of soliloquy, some sort of monologue, like I seem to be doing right now. But it was always in an endearing way. It always made me like his character. Honestly, this portrayal made me almost love Jud. And I can see why Lewis is so attached to him right from the get-go. It made me, along with dialogue like a man who lies about beer makes enemies, wish I could have a beer with him and look out over the main landscape at night and watch the trucks go past. That sounds like a nice, pleasant night. And really kind of made me more than mad at his inevitable fate. And that's what it is. It is fate. I'm not using that word lightly here. He was fated to die the exact way that he did. Even he knows it's coming. He says around that ending, Whatever was out there had been sent to punish an old man for his pride and vanity. He was fated to die just like Church was fated to die, just like Gage was fated to die, just like arguably Lewis was fated to die, whether by suicide or after the novel's open ending. Though I will say that paragraph that I referenced earlier, that whole part about Lewis thinking back on it, that seems to indicate that possibly there is more to come following the end of the novel. That's the takeaway I'm going to take. I like the fact that there could be a happy ending, though it's probably very unlikely. But the only death that I found surprising, all of those, of course, they were fated. I knew those were coming. The only one I found surprising was Rachel's. And I indicated that a little earlier. Like, she was a complete victim of circumstance, a victim of everybody around her. She falls victim to their manipulations, right? And, I mean, she goes through so much to get to her husband and her son. And when she finally meets the revived Gage, and she embraces him, and she's so happy, even though there's that little bit of touch of Zelda, and she embraces him, she hugs him, and he screams really, "I brought you something, mommy." I lost it. I woed. And I hoped, I prayed that I was wrong, that it was more like a Dick scenario from The Shining, where you think he's gone, but then it turns out okay. I kept hoping that she would be okay, that he wasn't going to do that. That King was just fooling me. He was just playing with me again. But I wasn't wrong. Which makes sense, given the other half of that mantra that we hear so often throughout the book. Because what you buy is what you own. And what you own always comes home to you. There were a few times I was wrong, however, and I mean, really, King seemed to have a habit of playing with his readers in this book, but following Gage's death, particularly, that one, it happened so suddenly, despite all the build-up, despite me just expecting it, waiting for it. And there's this quick moment shortly afterward where King takes it back. But none of those things happened, he says. And I fell for it. 100% fell for it. Hook, line, and sinker. And for a brief moment after the rug was pulled out on me and I realized that he was just toying with me again, I hated Stephen King. I really did. Not because of what he was doing to me, his constant reader, because that was it's memorable. It's a memorable occasion. I kind of like that when an author will do that. But for doing that to his characters, for giving them that moment of hope and tearing it away. But that's really what this whole book is about, right? Hope and tearing it away. This hope that you can cheat death, that you can keep a loved one closer to you than is natural, than possibly what is right. But there's no cheating death, right? That's the moral here. There's no getting around Oz the Great and Terrible, as we're told. And, as Jud notes, sometimes dead is better. I think I have a lot more to say about Pet Sematary because there's just a lot to unpack here. But let's call it a day here until we come back with the dissection of the 1989 adaptation, because I think it's going to give us a whole lot of opportunities to talk about a lot more. Until next time, and until that one, and I'm looking forward to that one. It's mostly written and it's got some stuff. I'll tell you that. Until then, if you enjoyed this episode, please like it. Please leave a comment below. Please subscribe to the channel. And if you want more episodes more often, head on over to Drunk on Writing and sign up for that and other things like behind the scenes, scripts, wallpapers, ton fun stuff. Oh, and extended episodes of the Drunk on Writing show. All very good, enjoyable things. So until then, until next time when we reconvene and talk about Pet Sematary 1989, cheers and keep on riding.